Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm 73 years old, and 4 months ago, I lay in my bed at 11 o'clock at night, pretending to be asleep while I listened to my son's wife tell someone on the phone exactly how she was going to speed up my death. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I had to sit with it in the dark for a lot longer than a second. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure she'd hear it through the wall, sure the blanket itself would give me away by moving with every breath. I didn't move, I didn't gasp. I just breathed slow and even, the way you do when you're pretending, counting my own breaths like Walter taught me to count sheep decades ago, and I let her keep talking. Have you ever laid still in your own house and realized the people under your roof were planning something against you? If you have, you already know that a part of you never fully wakes up the same again. Before I tell you what she said, you should know how I ended up in that bed in the first place, in a house that used to be mine in every way that mattered, and now felt like a room I was allowed to borrow if I behaved myself. If this story does anything for you tonight, if it makes you feel less alone in a family that stopped listening to you, then please subscribe to this channel for free. It costs you nothing, and it helps me keep telling stories like mine to the people who need to hear them most. The ones lying awake right now, wondering if what's happening in their own house is really as bad as it feels. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because in a few minutes, you're going to want to know exactly what that woman said into her phone, and I promise you, I'm going to tell you everything, word for word, exactly the way I heard it. My husband, Walter, passed 6 years ago, heart failure. Quick, the kind of quick that leaves you grateful and furious at the same time. Grateful he didn't suffer, furious you never got to say the last thing you meant to say. We'd built our whole life in a modest house outside Dayton, Ohio, in a quiet little pocket near Oakwood, the kind of neighborhood where the trees are older than most of the marriages and the porches still get used on summer evenings. Walter handled the finances, but not because I couldn't. He just liked spreadsheets, color-coded tabs, little printed graphs he'd show me proudly at the kitchen table, and I liked the garden, the tomatoes, the hydrangeas along the fence line. When he died, I found out I wasn't nearly as lost as everyone assumed I'd be. I had our savings, a paid-off house worth around $310,000, and a life insurance policy of $250,000 that Walter had quietly kept up for 31 years without ever once making a fuss about it. My son Michael is a good man underneath it all. I still believe that, though it got harder to believe as the months went on and I watched him grow smaller in his own home. He's an engineer, works long hours at a firm downtown. And about 2 years ago, he and his wife Denise sat me down at my own kitchen table, the one Walter built with his own hands one summer, and told me it wasn't safe for a woman my age to be living alone anymore. I'd had one fall the winter before, nothing serious, a bruised hip and a scared face on Michael when I called him from the kitchen floor. Embarrassed, more than hurt. But one fall became the excuse for everything that followed, the way a single crack becomes the reason to tear down a whole wall. Denise did most of the talking that day, the way she did most of the talking in every conversation about my life from then on. Her voice gentle, her decisions already made before the conversation even started. She said it would be so much easier if I moved into the guest suite they'd built onto their house, so they could keep an eye on me, so I'd never be alone again. And I remember thinking, gratefully, foolishly, that it sounded like being cared for. Michael squeezed my hand across that table and told me he just wanted to sleep at night without worrying, and I understood, even then, that whatever I agreed to that afternoon, I was agreeing to it for his peace of mind more than my own. I said yes because it sounded like love, and because some small, tired part of me was afraid of being found on my kitchen floor by a neighbor 3 days later, the way Mrs. Halloran 2 streets over had been found the winter before. I sold nothing right away. I kept my house rented out to a nice young couple, kept my accounts in my own name, kept my independence, or so I thought, packing only what fit in the back of Michael's car and telling myself the rest would follow once I settled in. What I didn't understand yet was that moving into their house would slowly become moving into their control, one small permission at a time. Denise started answering the phone when the pharmacy called. Denise started saying "we" when she meant herself, as in, "we decided you should switch doctors," or "we think it's time to simplify your finances," phrases that sounded reasonable in isolation and only revealed their shape once you stacked enough of them together. I noticed it, the way you notice a draft in a house, quietly, and then constantly, until you can't remember what warmth used to feel like. The conflict, if I can call it that plainly, was this. I was 72 years old, sharp as a tack, according to my own doctor's notes, still doing the crossword every morning in under 20 minutes, and yet in my son's house I had somehow become a topic that got discussed about me, not with me. Decisions about my pills, my money, my house started happening in rooms I wasn't invited into, at a table where my chair sat empty on purpose, pushed slightly back as if daring me to notice. I'd ask a simple question, like why my blood pressure prescription had changed pharmacies without a word to me, and Denise would smile that patient, exhausting smile and say, "Don't worry about the details, Dorothy. We've got it handled." Handled. As if I were a parcel to be routed somewhere convenient, instead of a person who had raised the man she married, fed him, bandaged his knees, sat up with him through fevers. The house itself made it worse, in ways that crept up on me slowly. The guest suite was lovely, don't misunderstand me, hardwood floors, a nice little reading chair by the window that caught the morning light just right. But it had a door that locked from the outside, installed, Denise said, for your safety, in case you wander in the night. I never wandered anywhere in my life except to the farmer's market on Saturdays and the library on Tuesdays. I started to feel it in my chest most nights, that particular loneliness of being surrounded by family voices through the wall and still utterly unheard myself. I'd hear Michael's car pull into the driveway after work, the familiar cough of the engine, and some nights I'd get up to go say hello, only to find Denise had already told him I was resting before I even reached the hallway, her voice carrying that soft, managing tone. My own son believed her over the sound of my own footsteps padding down that hall toward him. There's a specific kind of grief in realizing your voice has stopped counting in your own family, even while your body is perfectly fine, your mind sharper than half the people making decisions for you. I want to ask you something because I think about it a lot, more than I probably should. Where are you listening from tonight, and has anyone in your own family ever decided quietly, without asking you, that you'd stopped being capable of choosing things for yourself, of knowing your own mind, your own preferences, your own worth? If this story is already hitting close to home, do me a favor and subscribe now, because what happened 4 months ago is going to make you sit up straight in whatever chair you're sitting in, and I don't want you to miss a second of it. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means the world to an old woman with a story she waited a long time to be able to tell. The injustice deepened in small, deliberate steps, the way water finds every crack in a foundation before the wall finally gives way completely. About 8 months after I moved in, Denise started going to my doctor's appointments with me, and then, gradually, instead of me, driving separately so I'd arrive to find her already deep in conversation with the receptionist. She'd call ahead, introduce herself as my caregiver and healthcare proxy, a title nobody had actually given her on paper yet, and the front desk, overworked and trusting, would simply accept it without a second glance at their computer screen. I sat in waiting rooms flipping through old magazines while she went back to speak to Dr. Coleman alone. Just to save you the trouble of repeating everything, Dorothy, you know how tiring these appointments are for you. I'd ask what he said, hopeful, and I'd get a summary 2 sentences long, flattened, edited, missing whatever detail she decided on my behalf that I didn't need to know. Once, waiting in that lobby, I overheard the receptionist mention my file had a note attached about family decision maker, and when I asked to see that note myself, I was told, kindly but firmly, that I'd need to speak with Denise about it, as though my own medical chart had quietly stopped belonging to me. Money moved the same way, quietly, incrementally, in a language designed to sound like generosity. I'd always kept a modest checking account for groceries and small pleasures, a movie ticket here, a new gardening glove there, separate from my larger savings, which Walter and I built over 4 decades of careful, unglamorous living. One afternoon, I noticed a debit for $600 I didn't recognize, and when I asked Denise about it, she said it was for family expenses since you live here now. It only seems fair you'd contribute something. I hadn't agreed to any arrangement like that. I hadn't been asked, not once, not even a conversation over coffee about what might be reasonable. She'd simply started treating my presence in that house as a subscription I owed automatic payment on. And my silence, my confusion, my not wanting to make a scene at Sunday dinner in front of the grandchildren, she read all of that, deliberately, as consent. The insinuations about my mind were the cruelest part of all of it, because they were delivered so gently, always in that soft, concerned voice reserved for people who genuinely believe, or want others to believe, they're being kind. "Dorothy, are you sure you took your morning pills? You seemed a little foggy yesterday at lunch." I hadn't been foggy. I'd been quiet because quiet had become the only safe way to exist in that house without being corrected. But repeated enough times, in front of Michael, in front of the grandchildren doing their homework at the counter, a comment like that stops sounding like a passing observation and starts sounding like a diagnosis being carefully built, one small sentence at a time, brick by brick, until everyone in the house has quietly agreed on a version of me that isn't true. I started doubting my own memory over things I knew, with absolute certainty I had done correctly, and that doubt frightened me more than anything Denise ever said outright. One night I actually checked the stove twice, then a third time, standing in my nightgown in that dark kitchen at midnight, terrified that maybe, just maybe, she was right about me after all, before I caught myself and understood exactly what she had trained me to do to my own good sense. My grandchildren, Emma, who's 14, and Tyler, who just turned 10, were the one bright thing in that house, and even that got carefully managed down to the minute. Denise decided when I saw them, how long, in what room, always supervised, always brief, as though I might do something unpredictable if left alone with my own grandkids for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. Emma used to sneak into my room some evenings anyway, barefoot on the hardwood, just to talk about her homework, or a boy in her algebra class, or her friends, real conversations, the kind that keep an old woman's heart beating for a reason bigger than a pill schedule. Denise put a stop to that too, eventually telling Emma I needed my rest more often than not, when what I actually needed more than rest was to matter to somebody in that house, without an appointment, without supervision, without a clock running somewhere in the background. Then came the conversation about the power of attorney, the one I still think about at odd hours. Denise brought home a document one evening, already drafted, already typed up by a lawyer I had never met and never chosen, naming herself as my agent for both financial and healthcare decisions, full authority, no limitations I could see on a quick read. She slid it across the table like it was a formality, like a form you signed to pick up a package at the post office. "Ah, this just protects you, Dorothy, in case anything happens while Michael's traveling for work." I asked to read it fully, slowly, and she sighed, actually sighed loud enough to be heard, as if my caution were a personal inconvenience to her evening. Michael sat there saying nothing, looking at his hands folded on the table, and I understood in that moment, with a clarity that hurt, that in any disagreement between his wife and his mother, his silence would always land quietly on her side. I didn't sign it that night, and I could feel the whole room shift because of it. I told them I wanted my own lawyer to look at it first, someone with no stake in either direction, and the temperature in that kitchen dropped 10 degrees in under a minute. Denise's smile stayed exactly where it was, practiced, pleasant, but her eyes changed, just for a second, into something colder and more calculating than I'd seen from her before, something I couldn't unsee once I'd seen it. "Of course," she said. "Whatever makes you comfortable, Dorothy." But 2 days later, my old family doctor's office called to say my file had been transferred to a new practice closer to Denise's sister, and that my prescriptions would now be filled at a new pharmacy, clear across town. Nobody asked me. Nobody discussed it with me over dinner or in passing. It had simply been decided again, in a room I wasn't in, by people who had stopped considering my presence necessary for decisions about my own body. I want to pause here and ask you plainly, because I think a lot of people watching this have lived some version of it quietly in their own kitchens. Has anyone ever tried to take control of your money or your medical decisions under the banner of protecting you, without ever once actually asking what you wanted, what you feared, what you'd choose for yourself if anyone bothered to ask? That feeling of being managed instead of loved is one of the loneliest feelings a person can carry, and I carried it for the better part of a year before anything changed. folding it up small and tucking it away the way you do with grief you don't have permission to name out loud. If you're carrying it right now, in your own home, with your own family, I want you to know you're not imagining it, and you are not alone in it, whatever anyone has told you. Subscribing to this channel is free, and it's how I know these stories are actually reaching the people who need them most tonight. There was a particular Tuesday that shifted something in me, a small event that in hindsight was the first crack in the dam, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. My old neighbor from Oakwood, a widow named Carol, who I'd known for over 30 years since our children were small enough to ride bikes together on Larchmont Street, came by for a visit, the first visitor I'd had in weeks who wasn't screened through Denise first. Carol had brought a photo album from a trip Walter and I took to the Smoky Mountains back in 1994, faded photographs of us squinting into the sun on some overlook, and we sat in the sunroom laughing over old pictures for almost 2 hours, the longest stretch of unmanaged joy I'd had since moving in. Denise came home early from her errands and found us there, laughing, unguarded, and I watched her face rearrange itself in real time from surprise into something tight and unhappy around the eyes. After Carol left, hugging me a beat longer than usual as if she sensed something, Denise mentioned, almost casually while loading the dishwasher with her back to me, that maybe visits should be scheduled in advance from now on, so we can plan around your energy levels. Dorothy? My energy levels had been perfectly fine for 2 hours of laughing about mountain trails and Walter's famously terrible sense of direction. I realized, standing in that kitchen with a dish towel in my hands, that the issue was never my energy at all. The issue was that Carol had seen me happy, unmanaged, unsupervised, talking freely about my own life, my own husband, my own memories, without Denise curating a single word of it for either of us. That was the danger to her, I understood then. Not my health, my voice, unfiltered in front of a witness who'd known me longer and better than she ever would. I started quietly, deliberately, to pay closer attention to everything around me. I noticed that Denise kept a small locked box in the closet of the home office, and that she got noticeably tense, her shoulders rising toward her ears, whenever I walked near that room for any reason. I noticed that mail addressed to me sometimes arrived already opened, resealed with a strip of tape that didn't quite match the original seal, slightly crooked, slightly too shiny. I noticed that when I brought up visiting my old house on Larchmont Street to check on the tenants myself, Denise always had a reason it wasn't a good week. The weather, her own busy schedule, my supposed fatigue that never actually showed up anywhere else in my day, little things, individually forgivable, each one on its own. Together, stacked up over weeks, they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee anymore, no matter how much I wanted, desperately, to believe the best about the woman my son had chosen to marry. I started keeping a small mental ledger of dates and small oddities. Nothing written down yet, nothing I could point to, just a quiet private inventory an old woman was building in the back of her own mind. The way Walter used to keep track of which birds had visited the feeder, and which mornings they simply didn't show. One evening, Michael and I had a rare moment alone on the back porch, just the two of us and the citronella candle, and I asked him directly if he thought I seemed confused lately, forgetful, unlike the mother he'd always known. He looked genuinely surprised by the question, his eyebrows lifting. "No, Mom, you seem sharp as ever to me, sharper than half the guys at my office, honestly." I asked him then, carefully, why Denise kept suggesting otherwise to other people, to the doctor's office, to Emma, to anyone who'd listen. He got quiet, shifting in his chair, uncomfortable, and said Denise just worried a lot, that she meant well, that I shouldn't read too much into a few offhand comments. I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly I could taste it. I wanted, more than almost anything else in that season of my life, for my son to see clearly what I was slowly starting to see myself. But I understood that night, watching him avoid my eyes, that Michael's love for his wife had made him a very convenient, very comfortable kind of blind. The mini turning point came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I went looking for my reading glasses in the drawer of the hallway credenza, and found instead a folder of documents that had no business being casually filed where anyone might stumble across them. Inside was a printout, a rough real estate valuation of my old house on Larchmont Street, with a handwritten note in Denise's careful cursive that read, "Worth more sold now than rented. Talk to M about listing before market cools." Nobody had discussed selling my house with me ever in any conversation I could remember. It was still legally mine, still generating rental income each month that came, I now realized with a cold drop in my stomach, into an account Denise had started monitoring more closely than I had myself. My hands were actually shaking when I closed that folder and slid it back into the drawer, exactly as I'd found it, careful not to leave a single edge out of place. That night I didn't say anything to anyone, not a word, not even a raised eyebrow at dinner. I went to bed early, complained of a headache, and lay there turning the whole discovery over and over in my mind, wondering how many other decisions about my life had already been made without me, filed away in drawers I wasn't supposed to open, in conversations I wasn't invited to overhear. I thought about Walter, about how carefully he'd built that life insurance policy over 31 years. About how he used to say, tapping the kitchen table for emphasis, "Dorothy, whatever happens, you make sure nobody ever tells you what you're capable of." I hadn't understood back then, sitting across from him at that very table, how literally I'd need to hold on to those words one day, alone in a house that wasn't fully mine anymore. Lying there in the dark, I made a private decision that surprised even me with its coldness. I decided to start paying very, very close attention and to stop announcing a single thing I noticed. Things accelerated in the weeks that followed in ways that, looking back now, I should have expected, but somehow still didn't see coming clearly enough. Denise began insisting on organizing my pills herself every night in one of those plastic weekly organizers with the days of the week printed brightly on the lid. "So nothing gets missed, Dorothy. At your age it's so easy to double up by accident, and we can't risk that." I'd taken my own blood pressure medication, lisinopril, correctly, on my own, for over a decade without a single mistake or missed dose. But I let her do it anyway, partly to keep the peace in that house, partly because some instinct I couldn't yet name told me to watch closely rather than object loudly and tip my hand. I started noticing within about 10 days that one of the pills in the Wednesday and Friday compartments looked slightly different from the others in every other slot. A paler shade of white, a faint but unmistakable difference in the shape of the tablet's edge. I even held one up to the kitchen window one afternoon, turning it in the light like I used to turn Walter's old coins over in my palm, and the shape was just slightly rounder, slightly less crisp at the edge, a detail so small most people would never think twice about it. I said nothing out loud, not a whisper, but I began quietly saving one pill from each week, wrapped carefully in a tissue, tucked into the pocket of an old cardigan hanging at the very back of my closet, a cardigan Denise had no reason to ever touch or notice. I told myself some nights that I was probably imagining things, that pharmacies change manufacturers all the time for perfectly boring reasons, that this was simply an old woman getting paranoid in a house that already made her feel small and unnecessary. But some part of me, the part that had balanced a household checkbook for 40 years without a single error and raised a son on instinct and grocery store math, refused flatly to let the observation go unexamined. I kept collecting, quietly, patiently, waiting for a reason to explain it away, or dreading somewhere underneath that I already had one. Around that same time, I overheard Denise on a phone call out in the garage, the side door left slightly ajar for the evening air, talking to someone about the timeline, about how these things take longer than people think, especially with the estate stuff still pending on her end. I couldn't make out clearly who she was speaking to that first time, a sister of hers named Renee. I later learned through the investigation, someone Denise trusted with things she'd never dream of saying out loud in front of Michael. I stood frozen in the laundry room doorway, a basket of warm towels balanced against my hip, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my life, my estate, my timeline, in the same flat, efficient tone she might use scheduling a kitchen renovation, not a living, breathing woman 2 rooms away who had once rocked her own husband to sleep as a baby. I set the towels down very quietly on the dryer and went back to my room without a sound. That was the week I started sleeping lighter on purpose, training myself back into old habits like a soldier easing back into a uniform. I stopped fully taking the evening sedative Dr. Coleman's new office had prescribed for sleep support, a small pill Denise handed me each night with a glass of water, and a gentle, insistent smile that no longer felt gentle to me at all because some instinct told me I needed my mind clear far more than I needed a full, dreamless night's rest. I palmed the pill under my tongue and spit it quietly into a tissue once she'd left the room, night after night, and pretended to drift off within minutes, breathing slow, the way she seemed to expect of me. I lay there in the dark with my eyes closed and my hearing wide open, a 73-year-old woman running her own quiet surveillance operation in a house that had once been full of nothing but trust and Sunday pancakes. I want to stop here and ask you something honestly, because I think this is the moment a lot of people's stories quietly turn, even if nobody around them notices the shift happening yet. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped hoping someone would finally treat you fairly and started instead simply protecting yourself with whatever quiet means you had left? That shift from hurt to strategy, from waiting patiently to be believed, to deciding calmly to gather your own proof, is a lonely one to make alone in the dark, but it is also, I promise you, the beginning of getting your power back. If you've ever felt that particular shift happen in your own chest, at your own kitchen table, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to this channel right now for free, because the next part of what happened to me is exactly why that instinct matters so much. And I don't want you to miss a single detail of what came next. It was on a Tuesday night in March that everything I'd been quietly gathering finally had a reason behind it, a reason so clear it still makes my hands cold to describe. I'd spit out my evening pill as usual, lay still with my eyes closed, my breathing slow and deliberate, when I heard my bedroom door open just a crack, the way it did every single night when Denise checked on me before bed, like a warden doing rounds. She stood there a long moment, longer than usual, studying me, and then I heard her footsteps move down the hall, not toward her own room, but toward the garage. Phone already pressed to her ear, her voice pitched low in that particular register people use when they're absolutely certain no one else in the house is awake to hear them. Through the wall, with the garage side door left slightly open for the cool night air, I heard her say, clear as anything I have ever heard in my life, she's out cold. She takes forever to fall asleep otherwise. This way she's down for the count for hours. My whole body went rigid under the blankets, every muscle locking at once, but I kept my breathing slow, in, out, the way you learn to do when your life quite literally depends on looking asleep. Then I heard the sentence that has stayed lodged in my chest, word for word, every single day since. If we just bump the dosage up a little more on the lisinopril substitute, the doctor said it stresses an older heart faster over time. Nobody questions it at her age. It just looks natural on paper. I lay there absolutely still while my daughter-in-law discussed, in a calm, almost bored tone you'd use for a grocery list, the mechanics of ending my life in a way designed to look like nothing more than an old woman's heart quietly giving out one ordinary night. She kept talking, telling Renee that once it's done, the house on Larchmont Street could finally be sold without me dragging my feet about tenants and leases and sentimental attachment, that the life insurance payout would clear the second mortgage on their own house comfortably and leave plenty left over. Besides that Michael doesn't need to know the details, he just needs to grieve properly and move on. That's honestly all he's good for in a crisis anyway. That last sentence, about my own son, delivered with such casual, breathtaking contempt, told me everything I needed to know about how little regard she actually had for either one of us underneath all that soft, managing kindness. I don't have adequate words for what that particular kind of fear feels like. Lying in the dark, eyes closed, while someone calmly plans your death 2 rooms away and refers to your entire life as an inconvenience with a timeline attached to it. I wanted to scream loud enough to wake the whole street. I wanted to march into that garage right then and demand she explain herself to my face, watch her scramble for an excuse. but some steadier, colder part of me, maybe the very part Walter always said I underestimated in myself, told me plainly that confronting her that night would accomplish nothing except giving her time to cover her tracks before anyone with authority believed a single word out of my mouth. So I stayed still. I stayed quiet, and when she finally came back down the hall and eased my door shut with that same careful click, I opened my eyes in the dark and made myself a promise I intended to keep to the letter. I was not going to be a victim of somebody else's timeline. I was going to become, very quickly and very quietly, extremely organized. The next morning I moved like a woman with a plan, though I made absolutely certain I still looked, to anyone watching, like a woman with nothing more than her usual quiet routine of coffee and the crossword. I complained gently that I felt a little more tired than normal that morning, which bought me a believable excuse to stay in my room later than usual with the door shut and the blinds half drawn. The moment I was truly alone, I took out my phone, the one Denise had set up for me herself, insisting it be kept simple, "So you don't get confused, Dorothy," and I used its camera, patiently, methodically, to photograph every single pill in that weekly organizer, the Wednesday and Friday compartments especially, side by side with the original labeled bottle from the old pharmacy that I had quietly kept, without explanation to anyone, at the very back of my nightstand drawer for exactly this kind of morning. My hands weren't even shaking anymore by that point, which surprised me more than anything else that week, as though some calmer, steadier version of myself had quietly stepped forward to take over the parts of me that used to panic. In that same drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old birthday cards tied with ribbon, was something Denise had completely forgotten existed. A small digital voice recorder that had belonged to Walter, the one he used for years jotting notes about the birds that visited our feeder in Oakwood, cardinals, chickadees, the occasional red-tailed hawk that used to send the smaller birds scattering. I'd kept it out of pure sentiment more than any practical purpose. A small piece of him I could hold in my palm, but that morning, sitting on the edge of my bed, I understood exactly what it was for now. I charged it fully on the little cord tucked in the same drawer, tested that it still recorded clearly, the mechanism whirring softly to life after 6 years of silence, and began carrying it in the deep pocket of my cardigan every single evening from that point forward, ready, waiting, patient in a way I had never once needed to be patient before in my whole life. I thought carefully, methodically, about who I could actually trust outside that house, because I understood, with total and sobering clarity, that I could not fight this alone from inside 4 walls Denise controlled so completely. I remembered a woman from my old church group in Oakwood, a retired nurse who happened to be Carol's daughter, who had mentioned once, in passing at a potluck, that her own mother saw a geriatric specialist across town, fully independent, entirely unaffiliated with the practice Denise had transferred my care to, without my consent. I called that specialist's office from the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock that actually worked from the inside, and made an appointment for a routine wellness check, under an excuse Denise couldn't easily object to, without revealing her own hand in the matter. Dr. Reyes, the specialist, turned out to be a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who listened, genuinely listened, for a full 40 minutes before she even glanced properly at a chart or a screen. I brought the photographs of the pills and the original labeled bottle wrapped carefully in a paper bag, and she sent a small sample discreetly to an independent lab for analysis, explaining gently that if my instincts were right, we'd have documented verifiable proof rather than simply an old woman's word against her own family's version of events. It took 9 long days for those results to come back, 9 days in which I kept spitting out the evening sedative faithfully, kept photographing the weekly organizer each Sunday when Denise refilled it, kept the recorder in my pocket every single night, listening in the dark for a follow-up conversation I both hoped for and dreaded in almost equal measure. The lab results confirmed, in careful clinical language, what my frightened instincts had already told me plainly. The pills in the Wednesday and Friday compartments were not lisinopril at all in the proper dosage. They were a substitute compound at a significantly elevated strength. Precisely the kind of substance that could quietly strain an aging heart over weeks and months and be mistaken by anyone not looking closely enough for a natural, unremarkable decline. Dr. Reyes was very clear with me, her voice steady and grave. This wasn't a pharmacy error. Pharmacy errors don't happen in a targeted pattern of 2 specific days a week, repeated for months on end, timed suspiciously alongside conversations about house sales and insurance payouts. This was deliberate. I sat in that small, quiet examination room and felt for the first time in over a year, completely and terrifyingly right about my own judgment, my own eyes, my own mind. Doctor? Reyes asked if I had somewhere safe to go that night, someone I trusted completely. And when I told her I was going straight back to the house where all of this was happening, she wrote her personal cell number on the back of her card and told me to call at any hour, day or night, no matter how small the reason felt. With that confirmation finally in hand, I knew I needed more than medical proof. I needed real legal protection, because I understood exactly what would happen if I simply confronted Denise directly at the dinner table. She would deny everything smoothly, twist my accusations into further evidence of my supposed confusion and paranoia, and Michael, caught painfully in the middle, might still choose her polished version over mine simply out of exhausted, worn-down habit. So the next call I made, from that same locked bathroom, was to an attorney a friend of Carol's had recommended years earlier for exactly these kinds of family disputes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Nancy Pierce, who specialized in elder law and estate protection, and who told me plainly on our very first call situations where a vulnerable adult needs somebody entirely, unquestionably, on their own side. I met with Attorney Pierce twice over the following 2 weeks, telling Denise both times that I was simply going to see Dr. Reyes again for routine follow-up blood work. Nancy reviewed my original living trust, the one Walter and I had drawn up together carefully years earlier, and helped me quietly draft an updated ironclad version naming an independent licensed professional fiduciary alongside Michael as co-trustee, specifically and explicitly excluding Denise from any financial authority whatsoever, present or future. We also formally revoked, in clear writing, any informal understanding Denise believed existed regarding power of attorney. Since I had, thankfully, never actually signed that document, she'd slid across my kitchen table months earlier with such casual confidence. Nancy called that single, unsigned pause, that one moment of caution, the smartest thing I had done in this entire ordeal. Nancy also helped me understand exactly how the recording I now had, and the one I still hoped to capture with more specific, undeniable detail, would function legally, since Ohio law required careful, particular handling of recorded conversations to ensure they could actually be used in court, not dismissed on some technicality a good lawyer might exploit. She walked me through exactly what still needed to be said clearly on the record, ideally referencing dosage, intent, and the financial motive together, all in a single undeniable conversation rather than scattered fragments. I understood then that I wasn't finished collecting evidence, not quite yet. I needed one more conversation, one more long night of lying perfectly still in the dark, waiting for Denise to say, out loud and specifically, the exact words that would leave absolutely no room for doubt or clever reinterpretation later. I didn't have to wait long, as it turned out. 2 weeks after my lab results came back, Denise mentioned at dinner one evening, almost giddily, that a lawyer she'd hired, not Nancy, a different one entirely, had drafted paperwork for a formal guardianship hearing, framing it to Michael as simply making things official and easier for everyone, given Dorothy's memory lapses lately. I sat there eating my pot roast calmly, nodding along, agreeing that, yes, things had felt a little harder lately, playing the exact part she'd already written for me in her head months ago. That night, lying in bed with Walter's little recorder tucked warm against my palm under the blanket, I heard her familiar garage door voice again, low and certain, and this time, at last, she said everything Nancy and I needed, clearly, completely on the record once and for all. The guardianship hearing date arrived faster than I expected, scheduled conveniently for Denise at a courthouse clear across town, where she clearly assumed no one from my side would think to properly prepare in time. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Nancy Pierce had already filed a formal objection on my behalf weeks earlier, along with a full evidentiary packet, the lab results confirming the tampered medication, the pharmacy record showing the exact timeline of the substitution, and a certified transcript of both recorded conversations, time-stamped and independently verified by a forensic audio specialist. I walked into that courtroom on my own 2 feet that morning, wearing the blue dress Walter always liked best on me, with Nancy steady at my side, and Dr. Reyes prepared to testify to my full mental competence if a single person in that room dared to suggest otherwise. Denise arrived confident that morning, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, clearly expecting a formality, a rubber stamp on a decision she believed she'd already made completely inevitable weeks ago. Michael sat beside her, looking uneasy in a way I hadn't seen from him in months, as though some quiet part of him already sensed the ground shifting beneath the story he'd been carefully told for over a year. When the judge asked Denise's attorney to summarize the basis for guardianship, he leaned heavily, predictably, on my supposed cognitive decline, my confusion, my inability to manage my own affairs safely anymore. It was, almost word for word, the exact script Denise had been quietly rehearsing in that kitchen for over a year, and it very nearly worked precisely the way she'd carefully planned it to. Then Nancy stood, calm and perfectly measured, and asked the court's permission to introduce evidence directly relevant to Denise's own fitness and true motives regarding my care. The lab report went first, entered into the official record, confirming the substituted elevated dosage medication found specifically in the pill compartments Denise herself had personally filled every single week without fail. I watched the color drain slowly visibly from her face as the judge read the lab findings aloud methodically, without a shred of sympathy for how it sounded out loud in a public room full of strangers. Michael's hand, I noticed from across the room, slowly slid away from hers on the table between them, an inch, then 2. A small, involuntary retreat that told me more in that instant than any words could have managed. The recording came next, played aloud in that hushed, silent courtroom. My daughter-in-law's own voice, clear and utterly unmistakable, discussing dosage increases, timelines, insurance payouts, and my own son's supposed uselessness once I was finally gone. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone hears their own cruelty played back to them in front of strangers with the power to judge it fairly. And that silence lasted nearly a full minute after the recording finally ended. Denise tried, briefly, weakly, to claim the recording had somehow been taken out of context, but Nancy simply asked the court evenly to consider what possible context could ever redeem a sentence about bumping up a dosage because nobody questions it at her age. The instrument of her own downfall, in the end, was entirely and completely her own making, built piece by piece with her own hands. It was the very pill she had swapped herself, tested and confirmed by an independent lab with no stake in either family. It was the very phone call she'd made, believing the whole house asleep around her, that condemned her utterly with her own careless words. It was the very guardianship hearing she herself had initiated, expecting to formalize total control over my life once and for all, that instead became the public stage where every quiet cruelty of the past year and a half finally had to answer for itself in front of a judge, my own son, and attorney Nancy Pierce, who had spent 2 careful weeks helping an old woman turn her own hard-won patience into undeniable, irrefutable proof. Even Walter's little recorder, sitting quietly on the evidence table in its clear plastic bag, seemed almost to belong there, as if some part of him had reached across 6 years just to make sure I was finally properly protected when it counted most. The judge did not hesitate long once all the evidence had been laid before him. He dismissed the guardianship petition entirely and immediately, noting for the official record my full, evident, unmistakable competence, and referred the medication evidence directly to the county prosecutor's office for urgent criminal review, given the clear indication of attempted harm through deliberate pharmaceutical tampering. Denise was escorted out of that courtroom by her own visibly shaken attorney. Pale, silent, the confident posture she'd walked in with that morning completely and permanently gone. Michael stayed behind in his chair for a long, heavy moment, staring at nothing in particular, And when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were full of a grief I recognized instantly, the particular grief of realizing you defended the wrong person for far, far too long. I felt no triumph standing there in that courtroom, only a tired, aching relief that settled slowly into my bones rather than announcing itself in my voice. Nancy squeezed my hand once, quietly, warmly, and told me the rest would move through the proper channels now, the police, the prosecutor, the formal charges, and that my job, finally, after everything, was simply to go home and rest in a house that was, at long last, actually and completely mine again. I hadn't realized until she said those words so plainly just how long it had been since anyone had described anywhere in my life as truly mine. The weeks that followed moved with a kind of quiet, practical momentum I hadn't experienced in over a year of careful watching and waiting. Denise was formally charged with attempted assault through medication tampering, a serious felony under Ohio law, and released on strict conditions that barred her from any contact with me whatsoever pending trial. The county investigator, a patient, thorough woman named Detective Alvarez, collected the original pill bottles, the full lab documentation, and Walter's little recorder as formal evidence, treating that small device that once tracked cardinals and chickadees at our feeder with the same careful seriousness as any piece of evidence in a much larger, more serious case. I signed my statements, answered every question honestly, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could reasonably measure, that my own account of my own life was finally, fully being taken at face value by people whose job it was to listen. Michael moved out of the house he shared with Denise within 3 weeks of the hearing, staying temporarily in my old rental house on Larchmont Street once the tenant's lease ended naturally that spring, as if the timing itself were trying to make something right. He came to see me almost every single day during that stretch, quieter than I'd ever known him to be, carrying a guilt he clearly didn't have the language for yet. I didn't rush him toward forgiveness, and I didn't pretend the last year and a half hadn't happened the way it happened. I told him plainly one quiet afternoon over coffee at my own kitchen table that I loved him completely and always would, that I would always be his mother no matter what, but that trust, once broken by whose side you chose to stand on when it mattered most, has to be rebuilt slowly and deliberately, the same patient way Denise's crimes had been uncovered, one careful piece of evidence at a time. My finances and my care returned fully, completely to my own control, with Nancy Pierce's updated trust firmly and permanently in place, naming a licensed independent professional alongside Michael as co-trustee, protecting both my assets and, frankly, protecting Michael too from ever again being solely responsible for decisions he clearly hadn't been equipped to make wisely on his own. I sold nothing I didn't personally want to sell. The house on Larchmont Street stayed in my name, rented properly through a management company I chose myself, its income going exactly where I directed it each month. The life insurance policy Walter had built so carefully over 31 years remained completely untouched, exactly as he'd always intended it. A safety net waiting for me, not a countdown clock ticking for someone else's convenience. Emma and Tyler came to visit me at my own house that very first weekend I moved back in, and Emma cried a little quietly in my kitchen, apologizing for things that were never in any way her responsibility to apologize for. I held her close and told her the truth as gently as I could, that none of what happened was because anyone in that family failed to love properly. It was because one single person decided love could be measured in dollars and convenience, and everyone else around her simply trusted too long before finally questioning it out loud. Tyler, 10 years old and endlessly, wonderfully literal, asked if Denise was going to jail, and I told him honestly that it wasn't up to me anymore. It was up to a judge and a jury and the plain truth, which had finally been given a real chance to speak for itself in a room full of people. Denise's trial concluded 7 months later with a conviction on the tampering charge and a related charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable elderly adult, resulting in a real prison sentence along with a lasting restraining order preventing any contact with me whatsoever, ever again. Michael filed for divorce during that same stretch, a decision that had nothing to do with pressure from me directly, and everything to do with a marriage he could no longer see clearly through the fog of what she had done to his own mother. He and I are rebuilding something slower now, more honest, built on actual conversations instead of assumptions filtered quietly through someone else's convenience. It isn't the relationship we had before Walter died, and I don't pretend otherwise, but it's real, and real is worth infinitely more to me now than easy ever was. If you're still with me here, near the end of my story, I want to tell you the one thing I wish somebody, anybody, had told me plainly a year before that night I spent lying in the dark. Getting older does not mean surrendering your right to be believed, protected, or heard clearly in your own home, your own life, your own body. The moment someone starts managing your life instead of including you, honestly in it, that is not care, no matter how gently the words are delivered over dinner, and you are fully allowed to notice it, document it patiently, and protect yourself calmly and completely. Exactly the way I finally learned to do when it mattered most. I think about that night often, lying still in the dark, listening to someone calmly plan the end of my life while I breathed slow and even beside them, pretending with everything I had. I could have confronted her right then, in anger, in the dark, and lost everything before I ever had the proof to properly back myself up in front of anyone who mattered. Instead, I waited, I watched carefully, I gathered patiently, and I let the truth arrive fully formed, undeniable, in a room full of witnesses who couldn't possibly look away from it. That patience, that quiet, deliberate strength is the thing I am proudest of in my entire 73 years, more than the house, more than the money Walter left me, more than any single conversation in that courtroom that morning. If my story reached you tonight, wherever exactly you're listening from, and it made you think of your own family, your own quiet, unspoken injustices, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear clearly that they're not imagining what's happening to them behind closed doors. Subscribing to this channel costs nothing at all, and it helps me keep telling stories exactly like mine, for free, to anyone out there who needs the reminder tonight that their voice still matters at any age, in any house. No matter who stopped listening to it, I never fell asleep out of fear again after that particular night. Not truly, not the way I used to. Before Walter died, and before Denise ever moved my life into rooms I wasn't invited into, I learned to keep my eyes open in every sense that actually matters, watching my own finances, my own medical decisions, my own family, with a clear, steady attention that no one will ever again mistake for confusion or weakness. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end tonight. I mean that sincerely, more than you probably know, sitting wherever you are right now. And whatever your own age, whatever your own family looks like tonight, I hope truly that you never have to pretend to be asleep again just to finally be heard.